All right. Good morning again to everyone who's joined us. My name is Rachel Wentworth, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania. And I just want to thank everyone so much for joining us here this morning and celebrating Fair Housing Month. So this year marks 54 years since the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And it's also the 66th anniversary of the beginning of HECP's mission to advance fair and equal access to housing opportunities for residents of Southeastern Pennsylvania. And for those of you who are less familiar with our work, the Housing Equality Center provides a full service fair housing program of counseling, investigation, and enforcement support for consumers who have experienced housing discrimination. We offer technical assistance and training on compliance with fair housing laws to housing professionals. And we also do education and outreach on fair housing rights and responsibilities to a variety of audiences. So in the past year, we kind of hit an exciting milestone that we ended discriminatory policies at over 50,000 units of housing throughout the greater Philadelphia and the Lehigh Valley areas through our enforcement efforts from the time that we started keeping track of those numbers of units that we opened up to individuals of protected classes. So this is 50,000 units of housing that was made available to individuals and families who had previously been excluded due to discrimination. And while we're very proud of the work that we do here, ending discrimination in housing and moving towards equity and access to housing and housing-related financial transactions requires a range of tools and approaches and the expertise of many sectors and many organizations. This Fair Housing Month, we want to highlight a variety of perspectives as to current barriers to housing equity and the policy changes that are necessary to bring about fairness and housing access for all of our neighbors in Southeastern Pennsylvania. So before we move on to hearing from our speakers and panelists, I'd like to especially thank Patricia Bell, our outreach coordinator here at the Housing Equality Center, for putting together the program for today and for all of her organization and planning in bringing together this group of dedicated housing advocates. And I'd also really like to thank all of our speakers and panelists for taking the time today to share your expertise with us. So first up, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Punter, who is the Philadelphia Program Director of HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And she's here to deliver a Fair Housing Month message from FHEO.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. Happy Fair Housing Month. Rachel and team, on behalf of HUD, thank you for having me. The fair housing message that I will provide today aligns with the discussion points on the agenda, including but not limited to what policies are necessary to increase housing equity and how can stakeholders help support the community in identifying discrimination and barriers to equitable housing. So with that, I'll jump right in. So on June 1st, 2021, the centennial of the Tulsa Race Massacre, President Biden announced the creation of the Interagency Task Force on Property Appraisal and Valuation Equity, also known as PAVE, to develop a transformative set of actions to root out racial and ethnic bias in home valuations. HUD, the White House Domestic Policy Council, and 11 other federal agencies are members of the task force. These principal agency leads serve in an advisory role, helping design federal interventions to advance valuation equity. Recent stories of appraisal discrimination have captured national headlines. Stories like a Black couple in California who received an appraisal far lower than they expected, even after substantial home improvements. When they asked a white friend to pose as the homeowner for a second appraisal, the home was valued roughly $500,000 more than it appraised just a few weeks prior. The task force was responsible for delivering a final action plan or report that, one, describes the extent, causes, and consequences of undervaluing properties, and finalizes and releases a roadmap of consumer-facing and industry actions and policy implementation that agencies and other participants can commit to address the undervaluing of properties. The historical nature of inequity and unjust practices within the home buying process offer tremendous opportunity to deliver on the Biden administration's mission to advance racial equity and equal opportunity. The president created the PAVE task force as a method to address the nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing practices and policies, which have been a contributing factor in the home ownership gap and undervaluation of properties owned by families of color. Most people have the desire to accumulate wealth to add a sense of security for their families and generations to come. Some families are working multiple jobs to save enough money to purchase a home, and they should have the opportunity to benefit from a fair, equitable value. Value should not be dictated by the color of a person's skin or a racial makeup of a neighborhood. Home ownership is hindered by inequities within the current home lending and appraisal processes, which research shows disproportionately impact people of communities of color. Because a home is typically the largest investment an average American makes, this disparity is the biggest driver of the racial wealth gap. Today, the median white family holds 8 times the wealth of the typical Black family and 5 times the wealth of a typical Latino family. Home ownership remains perhaps the biggest wealth driver that reflects wide racial and ethnic disparities in both the rate of home ownership and the financial return associated with owning a home. Only 7% of appraisals in minority white census tracts come in below contract price, compared to, and that's in white neighborhoods, let me be clear, compared to 12% in minority Black and 15% in minority Latino neighborhoods. Over time, such patterns can dampen home prices in Black and Brown communities, further contributing to the growing racial wealth gap. More than 50 years ago, it's been more than 50 years ago since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. The racial home ownership gap has actually widened. In 2021, Black home ownership rate reached only 44%, while the white home ownership rate reached 74%. According to recent studies, eliminating racial disparities in rates of home ownership will shrink the wealth gap between Black and white households by 31% and between Latino and white households by 28%. Recent news stories of discrimination have captured national headlines, as mentioned before. These individual stories have been validated by evidence-based research that shows a neighborhood's average appraisal value tends to increase. It tends to increase as the share of Black and Brown residents decrease. So what can you expect to see in the report? And some of you may have already seen the report, others may not. But in the report, it is the appraisal bias is not simply an anecdotal account of an individual's experience. Individuals as well as neighborhoods have suffered a loss of wealth over time. Over the last few months, PAVE held numerous listening sessions for a variety of groups, including meeting with 150 independent appraisers, appraisal management companies, lenders, advocacy groups, and philanthropic organizations. PAVE listened to their perspective on what is working and what needs to be fixed. One second, my slide just got out of order. Thank you. PAVE also met with families who have experienced alleged appraisal bias, including a family and several residents in Prince George's County, Maryland. So what are the action plan key themes? They include making the appraisal industry more accountable, to empower consumers with information and assistance, ensuring that technology-based alternatives to human appraisals do not perpetuate bias, cultivating an appraiser profession that is well-trained and look like the communities it serves, coordinate enforcement to help keep the industry accountable, and leveraging federal data and expertise to inform policy, practice, and research on appraisal bias. The action plan is primarily focused on recommendations that federal agencies can take to use and improve their authorities and their enforcement. Where there is inequity, there is injustice. The data is irrefutable, as are the stories from the industry and everyday Americans. The PAVE action plan takes immediate steps to address this and other recommendations for the ongoing protection of housing civil rights. The bias and policies that have historically excluded underserved communities from home ownership have created a knowledge gap on how to successfully navigate the complex process of home buying. First-time home buyership courses will improve to be better equipped to educate consumers more explicitly on appraisals, help them identify misvaluations, and provide resources available to file fair housing complaint or dispute an appraisal. Home ownership counseling is offered to consumers by HUD-approved housing counseling agencies. These counseling agencies receive ongoing training and continued education to ensure best-in-class services, and this training will be updated to reflect the many learnings and tools available to help consumers identify and report instances of bias or discrimination. HUD also funds 120 local fair housing nonprofits throughout the country to help expand community-based fair housing educational campaigns. By connecting with these local organizations, consumers can help affect progress within their own communities and neighborhood. To achieve the full vision of the task force, further action is certainly needed. However, please visit PAVE, the website at pave.hud.gov. Everyone can follow the latest actions, gain access to resources, submit complaints, and stay informed on the continuing efforts to combat appraisal bias. And lastly, the task force will continue to use that platform, pave.hud.gov, to provide updates on PAVE and fair housing initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Next, I'd like to introduce our own Carolyn, HECP's Carolyn Steinhofer, who is the Intake Enforcement and Compliance Manager here at the Housing Equality Center. And she's going to give us just a brief overview of fair housing trends and the most common fair housing issues we're seeing currently in our region.
Thank you, Rachel. So the Fair Housing Act was signed into law in 1968, 7 days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Since its inception, the Fair Housing Act has been amended twice. In 1974, gender was added as a protected class, and in 1988, disability and familial status were added as protected classes, along with an administrative enforcement mechanism to the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. In 2021, an executive order was issued by President Biden, directing the heads of all federal agencies to fully implement existing statutes that prohibit sex discrimination to include sexual orientation and gender identity. HUD's Office of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity responded by stating that they will begin enforcing the Fair Housing Act to prohibit housing discrimination based on sex to include sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, for the first time, individuals who believe they have been discriminated against due to their sexual orientation or gender identity have standing to file formal complaints of housing discrimination. Along with these federal protections, individual states may pass laws which add additional protected classes in each state. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Act adds 2 additional protected classes in Pennsylvania: age, which they define as 40 and over, and users, handlers, and trainers of assistance animals for people with disabilities. A number of states in the country have passed laws which add source of income as a protected class. Those states require housing providers to accept verifiable types of income, such as housing choice vouchers and rental assistance. Currently, Pennsylvania does not have this protection, and individuals with housing choice vouchers or rental assistance vouchers find themselves being turned down for housing, despite being able to demonstrate stable, reliable, verifiable forms of rental payment. Many of these voucher holders and rental assistance recipients are senior citizens, families with children, individuals with disabilities, and minority households. So there's clearly much work still to be done to ensure equal and fair housing access for all. During the past 7 years, the number of fair housing discrimination complaints received at the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania have skyrocketed. In 2021, we saw a 52% increase over the number of complaints in 2020. The number of complaints that we received in 2021 represent an astonishing 228% increase over total fair housing discrimination complaints in 2015. The upward trend continues. This year, so far, we're seeing an additional 24% increase in complaints over last year. So our work is not done. And at the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania, we will continue working to advance fair and equal housing opportunities for all Pennsylvanians. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And so finally, I'm going to turn the program over to Patricia Bell, who is going to introduce and moderate our panel.
Thank you, Rachel. And then thank you, Carolyn and Dr. Punter, for your remarks and really setting the tone for the conversation today. I have the privilege of introducing some phenomenal panelists. But before I do, I want to remind everyone that we want to hear from you. So please put any questions, comments, or any perspectives that you have in the chat. Our Executive Director, Rachel Wentworth, will be monitoring the chat and collecting the comments and questions to share at the end of the panel discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to start introducing our panelists. And so our first panelist is Jordan Casey. And Jordan is the Director of Housing Opportunities Program for Equity at the Foundation for Delaware County. HOPE's services include housing policy advocacy, case management, housing placement, tenant rights education, financial literacy education, referral services, and direct financial assistance. Prior to HOPE, Jordan practiced as a housing and consumer attorney with HELP, MLP. And there he represented low-income clients in a broad spectrum of civil rights matters, including private landlord-tenant evictions, public housing matters, and consumer issues. Prior to joining HELP MLP, Jordan served as a staff attorney with Mid-Penn Legal Services in Reading, Pennsylvania. While in law school, he served as a legal intern at a homeless advocacy project in Philadelphia and was a student intern at HELP MLP. Jordan serves on the board of the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania, where he's the vice chair, and then also Regional Housing Legal Services and the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. He also serves as the vice chair of the Affordable Housing Advisory Council at the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh And Jordan holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the College of Worcester and a Juris Doctorate degree from Widener University School of Law. So thank you for being here, Jordan. You're welcome. Our next panelist is April McNeil, and April is the Prevention Program Manager at Your Way Home, Montgomery County. And in 2014, Your Way Home was established as Montgomery County's unified coordinated housing crisis response system for families and individuals experiencing homelessness or an imminent risk of homelessness. April has her undergraduate degree, Master's of Business Administration, and Master's of Applied Family Science from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. And over the last decade, April has honed her expertise in the field of family and community services by working with several nonprofit organizations, government agencies, and focusing on maternal child health, home visiting, and housing. April has spent many years working with Maternity Care Coalition and as a program manager, where she has managed the day-to-day operations within Montgomery County and Delaware County. And April was also featured in the Philadelphia Business Journal article, People on the Move, and continues to reside in the Philadelphia metropolitan area, where she is a leader in her community. So welcome, April. Our next panelist is Michelle Dembski, and Michelle currently works as a staff attorney for Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania in their Norristown office. Her primary focus is landlord-tenant law, assisting tenants facing habitability issues, evictions, and subsidized housing issues. Currently, Michelle is the lead attorney assigned to support the EPIC, so the Eviction Prevention and Intervention Coalition Program, a proactive joint effort between Your Way Home of Montgomery County, Legal Aid of Southeastern Pennsylvania, and the Montgomery County Bar Association. The program seeks to provide financial assistance and limited same-day representation to tenants prior to the eviction hearing to hopefully settle cases and prevent homelessness prior to eviction. And since Michelle began working with the EPIC program, it has expanded from operating in one magisterial district court to 7 throughout Montgomery County. Michelle is also the co-chair of Montgomery County's Bar Association's Diversity Committee, where she hopes her experience as a transgender woman can be helpful to underrepresented LGBTQ+ communities in the legal field. She's earned her law degree from Temple University's Beasley School of Law and was admitted to the bar in both New Jersey and Pennsylvania. So thank you for being with us today, Michelle. Our next panelist, Gail Schwartz, is the Associate Director of Policy and Program at the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. The Housing Alliance is a statewide coalition working to provide leadership and a common voice for policies, practices, and resources to ensure that all Pennsylvanians, especially those with low incomes, have access to safe, decent, and affordable homes. Ms. Schwartz has worked for the Housing Alliance for 8 years, engaging in the diverse membership of the Housing Alliance to advocate for resources to expand the supply of affordable housing and homelessness and fight blight at local, state, and federal levels. In recent years, her work has focused on promoting promising practices for landlord engagement, eviction prevention diversion, and emergency rental assistance. And in addition, she helps ongoing educational content for the membership through the Housing Alliance webinars and annual Homes Within Reach conference. She's currently a member of both the Allegheny County Homeless Advisory Board and the Southwest Regional Homeless Advisory Board. And she has a master's in social work from the University of Pittsburgh. So welcome, Gail. And our last panelist I'm going to be introducing is Ira Goldstein. And Ira Goldstein is the president of Policy Solutions at Reinvestment Fund, a results-oriented, socially responsible community investment group. Dr. Goldstein has conducted spatial and statistical analysis in communities in the United States. Those studies have been used by government and philanthropy to craft policy and to allocate public and philanthropic resources. He also has conducted studies of mortgage lending disparities, reverse mortgages, mortgage foreclosures, and predatory abusive lending practices. His work supported government-initiated civil rights and consumer protection cases. Dr. Goldstein created Reinvestment Fund's proprietary market value analysis, and that's used in communities across the United States and led to the creation of Reinvestment Fund's Child Care Access Gap Analysis. And for over 30 years, Dr. Goldstein has been a lecturer at the University of Pennsylvania's Urban Studies program. He instructs in research methods, statistics, and housing policy. Dr. Goldstein is a fellow with Penn's Institute for Urban Research and sits on the board of Child First PA. Before working at Reinvestment Fund, Dr. Goldstein served as the Mid-Atlantic Director of Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at HUD. So thank you all for being here. Now that we have some context from which our panelists' perspectives are coming from, I really want to just jump right into the discussion, because we know that these past few years for many people have put many people in a housing crisis. Our office has been inundated with calls from people who are facing evictions, who don't have the resources to pay their rent. And as we see a lot of the resources, the ERAP funding beginning to dry up, the moratorium has ended. I'm really curious about what we're seeing in the eviction rates and if there are any disparities that exist. So my first question, I'm going to pass to Ira. Are there eviction disparities? Are there disparities in eviction rates? And if so, why do you believe that these disparities exist?
Thanks, Patricia. So the very simple answer to the first part of your question is yes. There are disparities in eviction rates that attach to people's races and ethnicities. And our organization's been doing research on the topic of evictions going back to, I don't know, 6, 7, 8 years now. You know, as we've sort of looked at that problem, particularly in the city of Philadelphia, but you see it in other research in other parts of the country and around the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, what you find is that there is a persistent, substantial, statistically significant difference that attaches to the eviction rates in communities of color. And those disparities hang in whether or not you can, or even after controlling for, you know, critical factors like income levels, presence of public housing, et cetera. And we've done some interesting stuff, I think, using a tool that the financial regulators use to try and figure out or to estimate people's races and ethnicities, because those things are generally not attached to eviction filing data. And when you do that, what you find is those disparities that you see spatially also attach individually, and that there's almost approximately a 3 times disparity between white people and people of color in the eviction rates in the city of Philadelphia. So that's the first part. The second part is a little more complicated, the why, you know, and I think that the why has several dimensions to it. It's a complicated problem and it's a complicated answer. Firstly, I think that you still see, the presence of the historic animus that people hold towards people of color. I think that that's is undoubtedly the case. You see it in case filing data. You see it in stories in the press. You see it in lawsuits that are filed privately. It still exists. It's not gone. And I think that that's probably part of it. You also see that there are economic differences that attach to people, and those economic differences lead to differential levels of vulnerability that groups experience based on, race and ethnicity and the like. I think also when we looked at Philadelphia data that there is this phenomena where disproportionately people of color are in public housing versus private housing, and the Public Housing Authority, it seems, uses eviction filings as a vehicle to promote participation in all the things that they need you to participate in, like certifying your income, occupancy, and paying your portion of the rent. And those evictions are often filed and then withdrawn, but it does not diminish the fact that those filings happen. We also think that there are changes in the real estate market that are associated with the intrusion of investors into the real estate market. And those investors are differentially and disproportionately transitioning what in Philadelphia have historically been communities of color that had high levels of owner occupancy to communities that are now investor owned. And those investors are different levels of sophistication and good practices and things like that. We think that attaches to the differential rates. And then lastly, I think that there are some phenomena that exist that are almost sort of sort of they build on each other. So you have a population that has a higher rate of evictions. Those evictions get reported. Those reported evictions limit the number of places that people can rent. Those places that people can rent put people under differential scrutiny and also subject to additional evictions. So there's this sort of, non-positive cycle that attaches to evictions, which will be very, very difficult to break. One of the things that we think is going to be important here is, from a fair housing perspective, paying attention to the kinds of landlord reporting services that oftentimes make gross errors, believed to be disproportionately associated with race and ethnicity, that sort of are part of that mutually reinforcing bad process. So the simple answer is yes, there are disparities. The reasons are many, and I think that they're probably more than the ones that I laid out, but I think those are a good start.
Thank you. And then, so Gail, I know that your organization has also done a lot of this kind of research. So I want to ask you the same question. Are there disparities in evictions, and if so, why?
Well, yes, and I think Ira laid out all of the reasons as to why, but what the Housing Alliance has done in our research in February, we released an analysis where we looked at eviction filings across the state of Pennsylvania, with the exception of Philadelphia, because they tend to operate on a different court system. But looking at the rest of Pennsylvania, and for 2019 and for 2021. And, again, oftentimes court records don't necessarily capture demographic information. So, we did do some zip code comparisons, looking at census data and what are the eviction filing rates, how many evictions are being filed per 100 renter households. And what we found is that, in fact, race and ethnicity definitely is disproportionately being, those communities are seeing higher rates of filings, or zip codes where you're seeing higher percentages of people of color headed households are seeing higher eviction rates. We are also seeing that, just simple rent burden, where people are paying either more than 30% of their income towards their housing costs, or more than 50% of their income towards housing costs. That is also a predictor of eviction filings, but income alone is not. We found that to be generally flat. We also looked at, communities where we were seeing large numbers of female-headed households. And again, we saw, another relationship between communities or zip codes, I should say, that had high rates of female-headed households. Also, renter households also saw high rates of eviction filings. So, again, I'm not saying anything different than what Ira is saying. Is, all of these factors tend to feed into each other and start to kind of drive this cycle of eviction, which then drives a cycle of housing poverty, which then drives a cycle of poverty all across the board.
Thank you, Gail. I really appreciate that. And even kind of thinking about how intersectional identities can play a role in what's happening in evictions. And Michelle, I want to ask you the same question. I know that you have a lot of experience working with a lot of people who are facing eviction. So I want to know what you're seeing, what your thoughts are. Are there disparities that you're seeing? And if so, why do you think those exist?
We are, thank you very much, by the way, Patricia. We are seeing a lot of disparities. My evidence would be a lot more anecdotal. I haven't done a deep dive into a lot of the actual statistics themselves. But from what we've been seeing, both in my practice in legal aid and to some extent with the EPIC program, is a lot of essentially evictions that have cross-cutting relationships with class and income. But we've also been seeing disparities on landlords who are willing to work with tenants and settle cases and actually work to prevent evictions, if their tenants are of color. And I tabulated my own client list, and just looking through it, and I was a little surprised to see this in the data, something like 20% higher success rates with clients who in negotiating settlements or preventing evictions with clients who are not people of color, for a number of different reasons. I do see landlords, less the big corporate landlords, more the smaller landlords, that are just not willing to essentially work with clients who've fallen behind on rent. They're less willing to accept the rent relief. They're less willing to even really negotiate with them. We've also seen instances where landlords are just refusing to negotiate last chance agreements for non-monetary breaches of the lease. We've seen them go out on a limb a number of times for white clients or clients of other races that I'm not seeing in nearly as high of a proportion. So we don't see a lot of overt racism in the sense that landlords are refusing to rent to people of color. And there's a lot of selection bias because we don't get those sorts of cases because they're not actually evictions. But we do see instances where they are selectively enforcing provisions of the lease agreement against people of color and not necessarily against other tenants. A lot of this could be institutionalized issues. It could be the implicit unconscious bias in the minds of the managers of these properties. There's no overt single explanation that I can point my finger at and say, this is the big glaring problem, but it's prevalent and it's significant on a statistical level. And ultimately, it is affecting a number of my clients, and I presume trying to extrapolate from that across the county. I will also say there are certainly cross-cutting relationships where clients who are essentially poverty-stricken and therefore much more likely to be eligible for legal aid services are much less financially stable and have been hit much harder by COVID and by COVID-related income loss. So when you have landlords more willing to work with them to accept those rent relief funds, those clients benefit at a proportionally higher rate. And any tenant that is evicted has to incur a number of costs that they may not be able to pay. Security deposit, first month's rent, last month's rent in advance to secure new housing, moving expenses. This is not a small sum. So even in cases where I've been able to negotiate an extension of time with a set vacate date, I haven't done any tabulation on the data on how long those extensions, but I do have instances where landlords are much less willing to even negotiate that issue at all. They say, no, we were going to move for this judgment. We've had instances where landlords have refused to consider a pay and stay arrangement, and instead they've simply non-renewed and terminated a month-to-month lease. So yeah, there are a number of issues that are all coming together to create a perfect storm that is disproportionately affecting these communities.
Wow, thank you for that, Michelle. And I think contextualizing what you're seeing with what Gail and Ira and the kind of the research is saying kind of helps to paint this bigger picture. And then I also really appreciate what you said around implicit bias, because I think a lot of people think, oh, discrimination, racism, it's this very overt thing, especially when we're talking about housing discrimination. But even an implicit bias in the landlords and who they're willing to work with has this kind of very drastic impact, right, in the community and the people's lives. And so I want to ask, and I'm going to direct this question to April about what challenges that you see in maintaining housing for people who hold marginalized identities.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. It was really great to go right after Michelle, because I basically see everything on the flip side of what she's doing. I also oversee the EPIC program, an emergency rental assistance program, in which we've labeled Air Care. And oftentimes what we see is a lot of what Michelle stated. So even if we're able to provide them with funding from the program, months and months of background, we will get families up to date. We've even, with this funding, we're able to pay for any housing related issues, financial issues that may have come about. And what we are seeing sometimes, not all the time, but what we are seeing often more lately would be that they're not renewing the leases. And once they're not renewed, we're talking about marginalized individuals. Race plays a part, and disabilities and things of that nature play a part. But what a huge factor would be is that some of these families are low income before the pandemic, and they're even lower after the pandemic. They only have 2 or 3 part-time jobs. It's not full-time jobs. We're not talking about at least $15 an hour. And so with that, it's once they're evicted, then where are they going? So with Montgomery County, it's really, it's not enough room for shelters for everyone that's being evicted. Eviction numbers have gone up since the pandemic. And so the problem is that there's nowhere for people to go once they're evicted. And so we really would prefer if we could work with the landlords while they're still in the homes that they are in, the payment options. But what's happening is that some, and not all, landlords, property managers are just stating they're no longer interested in working with this program, and they're denying the leases. And so it's just making it really difficult for these families. And once they're out of these homes, now we're creating a new issue of homelessness, couch surfing, going to shelters. We're putting people and children at risk of them losing their children because they're staying in cars across our county and the surrounding area. So a lot of people are going to be affected by this, especially as funding is running out for many counties, especially as we're entering 26 months of this pandemic. They only are eligible for 18 months of funding. Some of these families have already been behind on rent before this started. So we're talking about a poverty issue as well.
Right. And thank you for that, April, because I think that also puts into perspective how evictions have consequences for generations, right? And how families, it's not, with a lot of families that are going into eviction, and how that impacts and can have impacts for generations to come. And so, Jordan, I want to ask you the same question. What challenges do you see in maintaining housing for people who hold marginalized identities?
Great, thank you, Patricia. So first and foremost, thank you to the Housing Quality Center for holding such an important event and inviting me to serve on this panel with these wonderful experts, which you've all already heard from already. So when I think about the challenges I see in maintaining housing for people who hold marginalized identities, my initial instinct is to speak about what you've already heard, right? What is right in front of me. The things I see and hear about daily in the course of my work, include barriers to maintaining housing, include the general lack of affordable housing units, unnecessary and unrealistic credit, income, and employment requirements, history of evictions, inaccessible units for individuals with physical limitations, lack of source of income protections, high utility costs, dangerous neighborhoods, et cetera, right? A lot of what you've already heard. However, I think if we take a step back and take a look at this issue kind of from the macro level, right? What we are really seeing and having to work through and endure is the lasting effects of de jure segregation, right? De jure meaning segregation by law and public policy. And those who have read The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein are kind of, probably very familiar with this idea. For decades and decades, racially specific policies to segregate our communities were not subtle or singular nor intangible, right? They were numerous explicit laws, regulations, and government-sponsored practices specifically designed to construct and form the segregated neighborhoods that we see today, right? A nation really, but certainly a region of Black and brown urban centers surrounded by largely white suburbs, right? And while I'm speaking specifically about racial segregation, the same systems, policies, and practices were used to keep out those with physical and mental limitations, individuals who identify as LGBTQ. It is the same tools that were just pointed at different targets. So while a lot of these policies are no longer written as law, which is great, they have never been corrected and their effects essentially remain. So while it is important to acknowledge and address those issues we see in front of us today that everybody's eloquently talked about, I think it is critical to make the point that we cannot ignore the importance of and impact of the intentional discriminatory policies that were in place for so many years, right? Unless we take action to address both the issues of the past and the present, we will continue to see, I think, ourselves struggle for some of this housing stability we're talking about for those who identify this way. And it's still from Rothstein again, we means all of us, right? The American community, right? As citizens in this country, we bear a collective responsibility to rectify those past violations that endure today. And whatever route we or our ancestors took to get to where we are today, we are all in this together now, right? We are all facing these issues today. So to conclude and simplify my rant here, a major and often unaddressed challenge I see in maintaining housing for people who hold marginalized identities is recognizing and rectifying some of the root causes that led to our current problems that we see today that others have spoken.
Yeah, thank you so much for grounding us in that, Jordan. And that's one of my favorite Rothstein quotes, right? Is like putting this collective responsibility on all of us, right? It's no matter how we got here, we have a collective responsibility to change, right? To change the communities that we're seeing and to start thinking about these solutions. So thank you for that. And so now, Gail, I want to ask you this question, and I know you spoke about the research and kind of what the research is saying about disparities, but I also want to ask you about what challenges that you see in maintaining housing for people who hold marginalized identities.
Or maintaining housing?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, I think it's, again, sort of the same things that Michelle and April are talking about, like, you know, who gets a break and who has their landlord who's going to work with them and be solutions oriented versus punitive. Who is going to really have, you know, these sort of fair policies of saying like, okay, there's a challenge. What can we do to work together to overcome the challenge versus, you know, an ultimatum. If you don't do this by this time, you're going to get whatever consequence of filing or, you know, late fees and things like that. I think there's also sort of missed opportunity for that collective accountability of saying, you know, specifically when it comes to public resources, anytime we have public resources going into housing, we should have an expectation that whoever is, you know, managing that resource has a responsibility to prioritize stabilization over collecting rent, right? Over, you know, making somebody act the right way or, you know, be the good tenant, right? I often say that bad tenants are not bad people. They are people with unmet needs. So we have a responsibility to meet those needs so we can get back to a place of stability. So really looking at where we can start first, which is public institutions, looking at housing authorities, looking at other forms of affordable housing and thinking about what are they doing to really maintain and support long-term tenancy among their residents. And then, you know, from there, it gets, of course, harder and harder as you get into the private market. Again, larger landlords, you can kind of push more with laws and local ordinances, and you know they have large scale policies. But a lot of our rental market really is these small mom and pops that are, you know, all they have is an extra house that they came by, you know, whether it's the house they used to live in and they upgraded or they inherited it or something like that. And so we really need to start thinking really intentionally about how do we serve that type of owner to make sure that they are being taught good practices, that they are aware of good practices, because so many are kind of fly by the seat of their pants landlords who don't know better. And then, you know, in that absence of good information, bias fills in.
Yeah, thank you so much for that perspective, Gail. And I think that I mean, we know with COVID and a lot that with the moratoriums, we got a lot we've had a lot of conversation with housing providers who had, like these smaller housing providers. It's like, I don't have the funds to, not receive that rent anymore. And thinking about, well, how are we supporting people so that they can better support people, right? And build community that way. And Michelle, I know that you spoke about the disparities and kind of the resources that people are able to access. And I'm curious to know, are there challenges that you see in maintaining housing for people who hold marginalized identity, or other challenges that you see?
I do. And I think the largest challenge is essentially challenging the landlord's worldview. A lot of the problems I do see, I suspect, stem from implicit bias, sort of a death by 1,000 cuts sort of situation where there is no easy, quick answer. Education and outreach towards the landlords themselves, I think, would probably go a long way. That said, I am seeing now with the housing market being in utter chaos, a lot of landlords who are becoming much more selective about their tenants because now in certain areas, the cost of rentals, the housing prices are rising, and they are essentially creating a barrier to entry by marginalized communities for them even finding this housing. Because in order to, find a landlord, you have to pay an application fee. You have to spend the time and energy filling out applications, and they're not cheap. I mean, if it's a $50 application fee or a $100 application fee, and you're sending out 20 or 30 of them, which some of my clients are, that drains what little savings they might have left. And these are issues that we can't really get over. I think lowering some of these barriers might really help stabilize housing. Having landlords who might be willing to waive application fees or be willing to accept them for marginalized communities if we make clear the impact that this is really having on a wide scale. I don't know how likely it is that we're going to get widespread acceptance of that from landlords, but I certainly think it's worth attempting. I also agree that the problem is with smaller landlords, because this may be not necessarily their primary source of income, but they need to pay their mortgage. They need to make these payments. They're very nervous about renting to somebody who they're afraid might default on their rent. And that's not the most unreasonable concern, because there are cross-cutting relationships between poverty and race, for example. But they draw these generalizations, and having them know that these sort of resources like the rent assistance do exist, I think might serve to put their mind at ease. And I'm shocked, given how often the ERAP funding is not new. It's been out for almost 2 years. But so few of these smaller landlords have ever dealt with it. They're not even aware of it. So I think education would play a large part in that as well. Aside from that, the challenges to the barrier of entry and to keeping their housing, mostly community support I see as being the biggest issue here. If tenants have caseworkers that are willing to speak with the landlord on their behalf, I find they get better outcomes than if they try to solve the issue themselves, because usually there's bad blood. The landlord is just frankly demanding their money or demanding fixing whatever alleged breach there might be. Having a third party to essentially act as an intermediary and act to mediate or negotiate disputes between them has gone a long way to settling a lot of my cases. And while I do most of that in a legal context, I certainly think that having third parties involved to try to come to some equitable solution could serve to prevent a lot of these evictions before they happen. By the time they get to court, the landlord's paid a filing fee, they're emotionally invested in the case, they're much less likely to pull back and say, all right, let's talk about this like adults and see if we can come up with a solution that helps everybody.
Thank you, Michelle. I think that really makes me think about even the education and outreach that I do, right? And we do technical assistance and we outreach housing providers and realtors. But when we talk about it and you kind of like paint this picture about the significance of really bringing people into conversation so that we can help each other and support each other, it's makes the world of a difference to a lot of the things that we're seeing. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I want to talk about policy. And so I want to ask this first question to you, Jordan. What policy or policies do you see as necessary to increasing housing equity?
Great, sure. So this question, I think, could be its own, obviously, presentation as well. It's a very big question, but I'll name a few that I think are important. So one major policy I would like to see implemented is the expansion of and improvement of the federal housing choice voucher program, right? Carolyn talked a little bit in her introduction about the housing choice voucher program, but it is the federal government's major program for assisting very low income families, the elderly, and the disabled to afford decent, safe, and sanitary housing in the private market by providing the voucher holder with a housing subsidy. So theoretically, the participant is free to choose any housing that meets the requirement of the program. Unfortunately, the promise of the voucher program and its ability to provide mobility have fallen short, right? So this is in part due to the program being drastically underfunded. So the first thing I would like to see is the program fully funded to allow the 8.8 million low-income households in America that are eligible for the Housing Choice Voucher program have the ability to receive one. As it stands, only 1/4 of the eligible households receive a voucher, and those numbers decline even further when you kind of zoom in to the major population centers. So the vouchers also need to be made more competitive in the private rental market. And I think people alluded to this a bit earlier, but rent costs, as housing costs, have skyrocketed, right? So therefore, the fair market rent and the small area fair market rent calculations have to be reformed. So voucher holders are often priced out of private rental housing in desirable markets because a voucher's value is less than the market rent in those areas. And some of that, I would argue, as I said in my original question, is probably somewhat intentional. And an important improvement would be that these calculations be made to be a little more dynamic, right? And able to respond to markets with real-time data and made specific to the unique changes between neighborhoods, towns, and cities. But even with all these improvements, if voucher holders can't use the assistance because landlords refuse to rent to applicants with federal assistance, then these efforts are futile. So most importantly, there must be a nationwide source of income protection that is passed. Landlords should be required to accept tenants that meet their eligibility requirements regardless of their source of income, right? And this wouldn't help just those with vouchers, but individuals paying with alimony or SSI and all of those sorts of things as well. When thinking about how this relates to housing equity, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities tells us that the emerging body of research finds that living in lower poverty neighborhoods has important benefits for families, including improved academic performance for children and higher employment and earnings among adults. For instance, moving to a lower poverty neighborhood while young can sharply increase children's earnings in adulthood and chances of attending college, and can reduce girls' likelihood of becoming single mothers, right? Studies have also consistently found that living in high poverty neighborhoods with low performing schools and high rates of violent crime harm families' well-being and children's long-term outcomes. So it's a sort of generational work that needs to be done to begin to achieve the increases in housing equity we desire. I would also like to see some sort of renter's bill of rights that incorporated a civil right to legal counsel. Shout out to you, Michelle. We'd like to see more of people like you. And this would include provisions and protections to address habitability in homes, tenant privacy, ability to cure rent arrears and other lease violations, right? Without some of these programs even having to exist, and meaningful access to counsel in all eviction actions, right? Some cities have kind of done this, but I'd like to see it nationwide. And this would begin to truly address some of the systemic racism that is entrenched in rental housing, while also leveling the overwhelming power imbalance between landlords and tenants. Even exists in some of these smaller landlords that we talked about throughout the discussion today. There's still that heavy imbalance in power. Lastly, while some of these recommendations kind of have a national flair to them, we must remember that protections around source of income and right to counsel and good cause evictions can be instituted at the local level and even have been implemented in numerous communities across the country, including right here in our region, mostly Philadelphia, but they have it. So policies like these would be a huge step in increasing housing equity in the populations that need it most.
Thank you, Jordan. And I know Carolyn is like, yes, because she talks about source of income protection a lot. I mean, we have a lot of calls in our office people talking about, well, they're not taking my subsidy. And it's like, but unfortunately, source of income is not a protection in a lot of places in Pennsylvania. And so, yes, I definitely think that is something that we need to see. April, I want to ask you the same question about what policy or policies you see as necessary to increase housing equity.
So I wanted to chime in right behind Jordan, right? But I will not go overboard with that. But I will add and I will second right to counsel for all evictions. And I say that because if you're in eviction court for financial reasons, you do not, even if you're low income or a little bit above low income, you can't pay your rent, you can't afford a lawyer of any sort. And there's many access to free or low cost lawyers out here, but oftentimes they're overwhelmed as well. So there's not enough out here. So there should be lawyers for everyone who's entering eviction court. But in reference to the work that I've been doing over the past year, I would also add that we need to extend or making it a permanent rental assistance program. And that can come with also housing stability. That way it can support clients from re-entering back into the eviction courts. Research has shown us that if they have support, then usually they will not make those same errors, or they will have learned from different issues they have come across ending up in eviction court in other areas and aspects of their life. And also there are many programs out here that are supporting, or many options that have been brought to light, focusing on permanency for rental assistance. It needs to be an actual full program. One program that has been brought up so far is an eviction program, into an eviction program, and it's called the Eviction Crisis Act, and it's a really great opportunity in which it's ran very similarly to the ERAC program. They would be able to pay off arrearages and provide some forwarding months of rent, so that way they can support individuals from becoming homeless. So that Eviction Crisis Act would be a huge lifesaver for those. And this would not even focus on emergencies, right? So this would focus on pandemic style emergencies, I would say. This would focus on emergencies that people have every single day. So change of income, losing jobs, jobs closing because they're not able to survive with the current conditions that we're having, lack of hours at their employer, your car breaks down, you have to call out of work, but you don't have time off. These type of things in which all it takes is one day. Most people are living below paycheck to paycheck. And based off the amount of what most of the clients that I see, their paychecks already, their bring home check does not cover the rent that is available, especially in Montgomery County. So currently right now, Montgomery County, an average rent is about $1,700. And on an average for Montgomery County, according to the census tracker, families or individual can make $26,000. When you think about that bring home aspect of it, they're only bringing home $1,500 a month. They do not have enough to live in a wonderful county such as Montgomery County or the Philadelphia, Delaware County and surrounding areas. It's just not affordable. So we really need to come up with ways to support permanent rental assistance. Oftentimes they just need a couple of months to clear their heads. And also we need to have laws supporting having lawyers and programs like legal aid and eviction prevention court like we have in Montgomery County. and making sure that everyone has access to a lawyer when they go to court, especially for financial evictions. And I could go on and on, but I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, April. People need support. That's what I'm hearing. People need support. And a lot of times for people who have been historically disenfranchised, right, and don't have the same opportunities or didn't have the same opportunities throughout history, right, to kind of leverage housing and these different things. Support is necessary, right, to kind of get on the right track and kind of get out of difficult situations. Like you said, if your car breaks down, things that for a lot of people don't even think twice, right? That can really offset and kind of really redirect the course of what somebody's doing or somebody's life. Next I want to ask Ira about policies that can be implemented locally or nationally to help kind of improve fair housing enforcement.
Thanks for that question, Patricia. First of all, before I get into that, I'd like to say that one of the things that I'm actually proud of here in the city of Philadelphia is the city did pass a right to counsel bill, and it is now being rolled out in the first couple zip codes. It's an extraordinarily expensive undertaking and complicated undertaking, as you can all appreciate, I guess. And so, you know, it's going to take a while to get it right. But I think there was the acknowledgement of it. There was the council support for it, the mayor's support for it. So it's being done. And I think that's going to really yield good results for people. On the improvement of the enforcement question, I have a handful and a half things that I think would make sense. The first thing is Philadelphia needs to become substantially equivalent. It needs to adopt a law that is similar to that which the Federal Fair Housing Act offers to people, except allows for the enforcement of that law locally. I think that the closer the enforcement can be to the communities where the alleged discriminatory acts occur, the better that enforcement can be. And I think that it's high time for the city to do that. It will be in this year's assessment of fair housing as one of the policy recommendations, as it was before. I think it's also, as Patricia mentioned, I did work at HUD for a number of years as the Mid-Atlantic Fair Housing Enforcement Director, and I found that it was important not only to support HUD, but to push HUD. There were things that I would want to do, but doing it on my own was very difficult, but having the sort of the public push for it made it easier for me to move things through the agency. So I feel like in a constructive way, it's important to, you know, to support HUD so that it gets its funding and all the other things that it needs to function, but also to push HUD in a constructive way as it relates to fair housing. I also think on that supporting of HUD piece, supporting the FIT program, you know, that is the private attorneys general out there who are doing yeoman's work like the Housing Equality Center to uncover discrimination, to provide enforcement related testing, to do the education and outreach that's necessary to be able to sort of both avoid acts of discrimination, but also to surface them when they occur and to support those complaints when they happen. So I think that that's really important. We did some work on the assessment of fair housing, and you know, as you all know, it was not vigorously enforced for years under HUD, this whole process. And then during the Obama administration, it was made a much more significant progress. Under the Trump administration, it was completely gutted. And now the perspective is to bring it back, but use the period of time where it was really something and where it was really nothing to recreate it in a good way. And we have some suggestions around that. But I do think that, you know, one of the really important underlying pieces to making this a good tool is to recognize that the plain language of the Fair Housing Act says that it is a responsibility of every administrative agency to enforce their programs, to administer their programs in a way that's in furtherance of fair housing. So that means not just HUD, but Commerce and EPA and all those other agencies. I think three more, and I'll be quick. One is, I think, to use the buying power of places like the city of Philadelphia to be able to ensure that, for example, appraisers of color are used or preferred in government contracting for appraisal services. There's no reason why, and we see this in other sectors, that that you can give preference points for underserved or underrepresented professions or occupations. Might as well apply that in this context. And I think also you can use that buying power to incent those, for example, that the government uses, be it the city government or the state government or state agencies, that they deposit their funds in, to have those lending institutions really adopt those best practices like lender self-testing and all the other things that the Federal Fair Housing Act incents to be able to do. Lastly, I do think that the concept of education is really an important piece. And I think, several people have mentioned the fact that there really is a whole set of new landlords in the picture today than existed a number of years ago. And I think many of them are making innocent mistakes. Some of them not so innocent, but many are making innocent mistakes. And the kinds of education that, Housing Equality Center and, other fair housing organizations do, and trade associations, frankly, sometimes, around what fair housing is, what reasonable accommodation means, what reasonable modifications are, and when they need to be allowed and when they need to be paid for, and all those other things. That's critical. And I sort of was dishonest about my last. Now this is my lastly. The lastly is on that PAVE report. I think it was a terrific start. And I think that that PAVE report really needs to be sort of pushed at the local and state levels to do things that the federal government just can't do in that profession. And one of the things that we're going to be doing in Philadelphia is pushing very hard for HMDA-like reporting of appraisal information. That transparency is going to, I think, do great things for addressing the problems in the appraisal industry that, that had its corollary in the lending industry. So all those things together, I think, are part of a package of what we need to do to enforce fair housing, to improve enforcement of fair housing.
Thank you, Ira. And thank you for giving me permission to push HUD and for all of us to push HUD. And I feel like that's a very, very important point, especially with HUD's limitations and what they can do. I want to.
Can I interject? Can I interject real quick?
Go ahead.
Just real quick. So Ira brought it up again about the landlord education piece, and we've heard about, I've seen it in the comments, and a lot of people talk about it, and it's critically important. So I just want to plug very quickly the Housing Equality Center's landlord or property manager in Pennsylvania, Know Your Responsibilities. It's 93 pages, and it does exactly what we're looking for in educating landlords, especially those new landlords, right? About what they can and cannot do. It's critically important. So reach out and grab that manual. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Jordan. I really appreciate that plug. And then, of course, email myself, Rachel. You can go on our website or download it to yourself. But yes, it is a very, very wonderful free resource for anybody who would like it. And so, Gail, I want to ask you a question about the current policies. So what current policies do you feel create challenges to housing access for families, children, or individuals with disabilities or any kind of minority home seekers?
Well, I mean, I think, honestly, it's even before you get the housing. It's the whole search process, and it's the screening process, and it's the application process, right? It's, and especially right now with the market seeing record low vacancy and so much competition, it's really, really competitive. It's really, really challenging. And, if you gotta find a babysitter to, watch your kids so you can go house hunting, if you have any sort of mobility challenges or even access to transportation or anything like that, all of these things already put you at a disadvantage in even just getting to an apartment to view it. And then you have the screening practices, right? So we know that, families with children and individuals with disabilities and ethnic minority groups are all protected by fair housing because they're marginalized. But what are the things that make them marginalized? It's, disproportionately low credit scores. It is more frequent evictions. It is more frequent interactions with the criminal justice system. It is unfair employment practices. So, job searches take longer and people are sometimes terminated earlier. Like all of this is, sort of reinforced, but all of this is the things that people are looking at when they are evaluating you for tenancy. So there is that piece, right? And then there is, especially within the affordable housing, publicly subsidized sector, how do we handle those red flags or problems or whatever on paper when people are applying for public housing or LIHTC, and it's you get denied, but you can appeal. Well, why do we deny people? Why can't we just even have more compassionate language of saying, hey, something came up, so you're going to be automatically go through an additional review process. Could you please provide some additional information? So really making sure that we have solutions focused, person focused, compassionate, trauma informed language interwoven into all of our housing policies so that we are always treating people, no matter what their background or challenges are, in the most compassionate way.
Wow, thank you so much for that. I really love this idea of kind of this person-centered, trauma-informed approach to something that has been so commodified, right? And I know housing is very much so commodified, but then also understanding that there are people on the other end of that transaction and taking the time to understand the unique needs of communities, of individuals, I think is so important. Thank you for that, Gail. So I want to shift gears a little bit. And I know we talked about some of the issues with housing access, we talked about policy, but I want to talk about collaboration, because I think collaboration is very important in how we approach policy change, as how we approach solutions to housing access. So my first question is going to be to you, April. How can stakeholders work together to strengthen fair housing enforcement?
Well, you stated that we were shifting a little bit, but I think it was right after what Gail stated, is that we need community-centered support. And similarly to what we have been doing in Montgomery County for our ERAD program that we've locally called ERIC, in which we work with local nonprofits who are meeting the needs of the people who do not always have access to computers, to Wi-Fi, to printers and things of that nature. They are able to go into the office, get the support that they need, drop off documentation, and also working with stakeholders like this, they are also aware of the challenges that are happening within our community. So that way that they can support them with other resources, again, so hopefully they will not have to go back down this path. And if they do, there's again, somewhere for them to go back to. So that is a really important aspect of community togetherness and stakeholders. But I also, again, will bring it back to the legal side of things. We need to continuously support with the legal aids of Montgomery County, Philadelphia, Delaware County. We all seem in this community have a partner that we're working with those. But not only that, we should be working with healthcare providers. We should be working with education providers. We need to also be working with our local research firms to collect data that we've all spoken about, focusing on the evictions and knowing the racist tactics that sometimes are happening, whether folks know about it or not. And that way it help folks to help individuals, help the landlords, help people to understand the struggles that are happening for people. And again, we just need advocacy groups that's providing education on what we've talked about already, rental counseling and supporting the greater public. We should be using these days social media methods. A lot of times local and small homeowners who are stakeholders in this community who are getting into the rental world, they're not really sure of all the things that go into it. They're just thinking, wow, how can I make other sources of income? And that's very understandable. But we have to be mindful of those things as well. Know the laws that are in place, things that you should be doing, upkeeping your property, making sure that things are in good standards for your renters. And lastly, I would also say, similarly to what we do in Montgomery County, have collaboration and have good contacts with your court administrators and judges. So I think it's really important to talk with them as well. And that way, when clients do end up in eviction court, that they have a person to go to say, hey, I'm here for X, Y, and Z. And these different programs, stakeholders are all important in order to minimize homelessness, the eviction rates, and more.
Thank you, April. I really appreciate that. I think we all can be creative in the partnerships that we're creating, like you said, with healthcare providers and kind of these other entities. How are we implementing research into our own work, I think is a really great point. And I want to ask, so this next question I want to ask to Michelle about how can stakeholders help support the community in identifying discrimination and barriers to equitable housing?
Thank you. So, I mean, the biggest way to identify some of these issues, I think, is almost on an individual level. We have a lot of cases where tenants have informed us about particular issues with the landlords that have discriminatory impact that the landlords themselves may not even be aware of. I know we've talked about communities of color, but an example I'll use here is disability. We have a number of landlords who have taken the position that all animals are essentially pets and are either unaware or just blind and ignorant to the service animal and emotional support animal exceptions. And we've had clients who have had to fight, unfortunately, against the landlord, even for the right to have these animals at the property, being called unauthorized pets. And essentially the landlord was moving to evict on the basis of breach of the lease, or they're trying to charge them pet deposits and ongoing monthly pet fees. And we don't know about these sorts of issues until the tenants themselves tell us. So I think some sort of reporting function would certainly be very effective there. Another example of issues I run into that we need to have reported more frequently. We have clients who are on Social Security or Social Security disability, occasionally SSI, who get their payments later in the month after the rent is due. And then we fall into this horrific cycle where if the landlord doesn't get their payment, they charge the late fee. Then if they don't get it by the 15th, they file in court for eviction. And of course, once the client gets paid, they pay off the amount, or if it's actually gone to hearing by then, the pay and stay judgment. And they're incurring those late fees, those filing fees, and they can never catch up. It's just a constantly reinforcing cycle that doesn't benefit either side. And I believe that probably is a form of disparate impact discrimination against someone with disabilities that we certainly could make a case about. And we've had clients that have come in who have been dealing with this situation for months, or in a couple of cases, even years. Jordan spoke very eloquently about the housing voucher issue. We do have landlords, unfortunately, who tend to discriminate against clients with housing vouchers. They tend to retaliate if there are complaints to the housing authority about habitability issues that tend to trigger inspections. And if the landlord fails inspection, and therefore either needs to make repairs or risk losing the voucher, they choose not to renew the lease, or they choose to evict on some other basis if it's already rolled over to be a month-to-month holdover tenancy. I think having a sort of reporting function for these and having these sort of information gathering step would allow us to find out, exactly where these problems are coming from before they occur. And possibly allow us to address them with the landlords before it actually comes to litigation, either to inform them of their potential liability or to try to mediate the dispute, or essentially to prevent this from becoming, a matter of active litigation before a judge before it even gets to that point. I think heading it out before there's been a complaint filed and we already have a hearing date scheduled is an enormous benefit. It also will presumably save either party money in the filing fees and the time to prepare and appear for the actual hearing. And I think that's one of the largest ways that we can sort of identify the issues. Get them directly from the community, from the tenants who are being affected by them, and head them off before it heads to active litigation. Try to address them with the landlord, basically informing them, this is likely how it's to go. This is what's at stake. These are the issues you need to correct. And I think most landlords are litigation adverse. They don't want to sue. They just want their money. They specifically want this to be as easy as possible. They don't want to invest time and expense, their own personal time in, dealing with these ongoing issues. I think that would resolve at least a plurality, maybe even a majority of these cases. So that's my, that's sort of my 2 cents on what the community and the stakeholders can do, is try to intervene sooner in the process.
Thank you, Michelle. And even listening to you kind of talk, I'm thinking about, well, how are we meeting people where they're at, right? I think a lot of times we put stuff out there and it's like, oh, come to us and we will give you resources, right? But like meeting people where they're at so we can understand what's going on in the community and kind of begin to address these individualized needs and concerns. So thank you. So I want to ask Jordan, this question is going to be to you, about what steps that your organization or other organizations can begin to take with their community to address barriers to housing.
Yeah, great. So the Foundation for Delaware County, under whose umbrella the HOPE program sits, has made the issue of housing inequity an organizational priority, right? Which I think is pretty important. So as you mentioned earlier in my little bio that you gave, HOPE was created to provide housing policy advocacy, case management, placement, tenants' right education, referral services, and direct financial relief, because the foundation recognized the inextricable connection between housing, health, and opportunity, right? So as we work towards removing these barriers for individuals in Delaware County, where I sit, one of the most important things that I have noticed in conversation is it is important to level set, right? We must recognize that, and we kind of talked a little bit about this, throughout the presentation, that everybody's coming to the conversation from different starting points in different places. So therefore, when you are engaging traditional and non-traditional partners in the work, it may be worthwhile doing a bit of explanation or briefing around whatever topic or issue that you're discussing so that all parties are beginning the conversation with a mutual understanding. Because if you're having conversations with different understandings, it can become unproductive fairly quickly. Next, I think it's important to find champions in both, these traditional and non-traditional housing spaces. I've personally been amazed at all the people that are interested in these issues, but just kind of haven't had any place, to have those conversations or anyone necessarily to have those conversations with. Housing issues are not siloed. They are interconnected with and inextricable from all the other issues that our low-income families are experiencing. You cannot have a discussion around housing without considering racial equity, health equity, energy security, accessibility to education, right? All of these things are an important part of the conversation. By reaching out and finding these champions, we've had the absolute pleasure to work with Senator Carney from the 26th District and his Chief of Staff, Sarah McCullough, along with the rest of his team, the City of Chester Housing Authority, folks at Boeing, the Housing Alliance, Housing Equality Center, PNC Bank, TD Bank, Delaware County Government, PICO, and many more around these issues. I would encourage people to begin to have these conversations in your community and don't be afraid to say the quiet things out loud, right? The areas to be problematic should be spoken about candidly and not diluted and spoken around to avoid making people uncomfortable, right? These are uncomfortable conversations, but if they are had with respect and dignity, Gail alluded to it earlier, right? We can work and grow within these uncomfortable conversations to accomplish change. And to begin to brainstorm these conversations about how to make the system better. Look and learn from what other organizations are doing in the region. I just sat in on a wonderful call in Montgomery County around the work they are doing around improving coordinated entry through a racial equity lens, right? And I would love to bring some of these ideas and implement them in our local community in Delaware County. So, but lastly, I think it's important to think about using, the collective voice, right? We are working in Delaware County establishing a housing coalition that will include local and regional partners and those with lived experience, right? I think it's really, really critical that voice not be lost. To advocate, strategize, and ultimately act on ways to remove barriers and improve the state of housing for those in need. I know anecdotally, but it's my theory that it works locally too, that as a collective, we are really able to move the needle on these issues of need, where in the past, individual organizations ringing the bell may not have had success on their own. So these are just a few of the ways that I think our organization has begun to work in our community to address these barriers in housing. And we recognize that this work is ongoing, right, and not fleeting. So it will take this time to see the changes we need, but we're committed to the work, as are all of you.
Thank you so much for that, Jordan. And I really appreciate your remark about this collective voice, because that, when we're doing this together, I think that's when we can go the furthest. And so I think it's very important to, like you said, be able to identify who is doing that work in the community and then work together. Ira, I want to ask you the same question. What are steps that your organization or other organizations can begin to take with their community to address barriers to housing?
Sure, Patricia. So, our organization at its roots is I describe us as a financial institution with a public purpose. So we make loans to create affordable housing and childcare center and arts and culture spaces and federally qualified health centers and all the things people in communities need to have a good shot at a good life. And so, we have, over the course of our time, supported the creation of about 25,000 housing units. And, as we've become more understanding and knowledgeable about the issues around evictions, for example, we've been able to work with the developers of the affordable housing that we finance to be able to put the kind of proper practices in their leases and to use good leases that are not very one-sided or sort of non-standard, not understandable, and to use the tenanting kinds of practices that really are best practices for people. So, I mentioned before using buying power. We use our buying power, if you will, to be able to sort of effectuate those kinds of changes. And I think the entire CDFI industry, we're big as an industry into the creation and financing of affordable housing. We ought to be doing that. I think it's also, we're a little unique because we have a research function. Not every CDFI does. So we have been able to effectively, over the course of time, I think, been able to use our research capacity to surface issues like predatory and abusive lending practices, like the eviction issue. So I think that organizations like ours should be, purposefully conducting, what we always strive to do, which is objective, high quality, transparent research that can inform public policy and raise the kinds of issues that don't necessarily yet have a voice. When we first documented years ago about the fact that there were literally 20,000 eviction filings in the city of Philadelphia each and every year, it was just stunning to city council. They'd never even seen that number, let alone what we've been able to, and others have been able to essentially learn as we peel the onion on those 20,000 eviction filings. So use that research to point out these issues. And then I think lastly, it's important to recognize that gratefully we have made some progress in the fair housing space. The country, although still very segregated, and the city of Philadelphia is still segregated, we're substantially less segregated than we were 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago, et cetera. And, I think you need to sort of recognize that, at the same time recognize that you need to keep pushing. You're not, we're still, even though our segregation levels used to be at, 80%, let's say, and now we're at about 65% or whatever the number is, it represents a drop, but it's not over. And so, you know, you need to keep pushing these things to make sure that people sort of understand that, you know, as is often said, fair housing is the law of the land. And that means, you know, making sure that our elected officials, our investors, and, you know, that our organizations that are sort of connected to housing really do understand and embrace the importance of fair housing as part and parcel of, you know, an open and constructive and positive place for people to be. So to me, those are, as I think about it, the three things that organizations like ours can do. And I think some of them may apply to the organization that you all work with.
Yes. Thank you so much, Ira. I definitely feel like a lot of what you said is applicable to our organizations, and even just thinking about the power and resources that we have, right? That we can leverage and give back to the community, and how we're doing that, I think, is very important. I want to switch gears and stop talking as much, Rachel. So I want to open it up to the people who are attending for the questions that were put in the chat.
Okay, and I haven't quite a number of questions already. We'll try to get through as many as we can, but please keep putting questions in either the Q&A or the chat, and I'll direct those to the panelists. So first of all, I did have a request for the link to the PAVE report, the report on appraisal issues that was discussed really early on. I'll put that in the chat in just a moment if people would like to read that. So the first question is, and this is something that Ira mentioned a little bit in the context of appraisals, but there was a question about, is there a way to have eviction filings capture demographic information about race, ethnicity, age, national origin, sexual orientation, and gender identity? I think, again, the question is, you know, sort of, can we move HMDA-like reporting into other types of housing transactions? And anyone who would like to tackle that one.
I will make an attempt, and I will say I'm not a lawyer or a fair housing expert, so I will put that out there. But I think the challenge with getting really, really clear demographic data in the eviction process is that oftentimes it is the landlord that is initiating the process, and I don't believe they're legally allowed to sort of collect that information and report that information. So that's one sort of barrier to collecting that data. The other barrier is oftentimes in eviction hearings, there's a really high no-show rate on the part of tenants. You know, people leave because they know they're in a hole that they can't get out of, or sometimes they construe the notice of hearing or the notice to quit as an eviction itself, because this process is very, very confusing, and, you know, paperwork that is shared when this process is started is not really written in easily understood language. So, you know, we had that high no-show rate. And then, you know, courts, especially local district courts, are incredibly limited resources for these. So they can't necessarily collect that information from people when they show.
Yeah, I would agree with what Gail said. I mean, a lot of that information just isn't pertinent to the legal action, right? But I think what you can do is take some of the great work that Gail's team has done and others around that eviction data, right? And layer some of that other information that's available out there on top of it. And I think at that point, you could start to draw some of the conclusions you may be looking for by just kind of combining data sources. But yeah, as far as the courts collecting it, I don't think it's not really pertinent, but we also, I don't think really want the courts getting involved in that sort of thing, right? Getting all that extra data and stuff like that. That's not necessary to the action. So, but I think, yeah, combining some of the data sets that are out there I think you can start to make the conclusions or draw information that way.
Okay, and I'm going to just kind of move on and read through the questions here to get through in the time that we have left. Next question is an audience member notices that there's an influx of luxury apartment complexes with very high rental prices popping up all over. She's mentioning particularly Willow Grove and Abington. This does not allow those with need for housing the ability to afford the basic need for housing. Is there anyone who could speak to the reason for the push in these types of housing styles in our area in the last 3 to 5 years? And again, anyone who would like to tackle that one.
I'll take
Well, I
another
can't-
stab. Oh, please go, Michelle.
Okay, well, I can't speak to these specific townships, but we have seen as rent prices are rising, attempts to, I guess gentrification is the best word, to gentrify areas. Larger landlords, larger property management companies have been buying up properties and either renovating or just building entirely new complexes to try to sort of capture demographic shifts. We've seen a lot, especially of people selling in the wake of COVID. So in the past 2 years specifically, and larger property management companies buying up residential properties in droves. So I suppose there's an effort on their end to sort of capture the effects of higher income tenants, higher income clients moving into the area. And yeah, there is a push out effect. They're pricing out individuals who have lived in these communities for many years or decades. And I don't think there's a particular solution for that, at least not one that I could possibly get into. But I think it's merely an attempt to take advantage of the opportunity to charge these sort of prices to capture people that may not want to live in even more expensive areas in or near the greater Philadelphia area. I think it's purely economic, but I think it has a horrific impact on class and income, and therefore cross-cutting relationships with marginalized communities.
I would just want to say, I think it's easier to build luxury housing and probably cheaper to build luxury housing than it is to build even moderate income priced housing or definitely affordable housing. I think that there are things that you can look at land use policies like LRTA, tax abatements, things like that, that are, stimulating certain types of development over others. I think you also got to look at, how does the community welcome that development? Communities, there's a lot of communities when affordable housing is being planned, there's a great deal of opposition, and that opposition translates into increased costs. I mean, and this is completely anecdotal, but I remember speaking to an affordable housing developer and, flat out told me it is far more expensive for me to develop affordable housing for families than it is for seniors, because seniors are a sympathetic population where families are not. So, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, subtle factors that are coming into play that definitely go into, what is the role of affirmatively furthering fair housing and how federal resources are being applied, and, what type of development is being stimulated in your community. But the more expensive the housing, it's actually cheaper to build and bigger the profits. Also, we simply do not have enough resources to build affordable housing. The government hasn't made a full investment in the development of affordable housing, I think, at any time in its history, but it was essentially gutted in the 80s and has never been replaced.
Thank you,
Okay.
Gail. I just want to say thank you.
And the next question is regarding whether anyone is providing any type of housing applicant intermediation service so that a credit check is run only once and so that low-income minority applicants do not have to pay for transportation and negotiate with landlords during a time when they're under stress and potentially trauma from whatever the reason that they need to find new housing.
Well, I can speak to that. Well, some of those concerns. So under the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, if in Montgomery County, if a client or a family, individual, however you want it to be identified, is evicted for a financial matter, we do support with first, last, and security. And if needed, we could support with application fees to, as far as getting into a new place. That still doesn't cover all of the needs because, again, you're putting out applications at several different places as far as it running credit scores and things of that nature. You know, we can't really stop that, but we are able to support a little bit under that program, under the housing stability aspect of the program. So this is a way that we can do a little bit of that. Also, I spoke of our nonprofits. They often will call the landlords and say, hey, they're one of our, they're a client in our program and we're able to support them in this way. And sometimes, not always, sometimes they are willing to work with us because they are familiar with this program.
Okay, thanks so much. And I have kind of a follow-up question that leads that leads from that topic about, and I think Michelle, April, Gail maybe have some experience with this. Is there any type of program that connects some landlords who do understand these issues and are willing to work with voucher holders or individuals who receive other subsidies or housing programs and have them connect to other landlords on their positive experiences?
So it's not necessarily a program, but I think a community strategy to do these things, right? And we've seen this a lot in the homelessness sector where they create a system-wide housing navigator or landlord liaison, somebody who is essentially supposed to be the connection between, you know, the homelessness system, the unified housing crisis response system, as April put it, and the private market where people need to go to, you know, as they exit their episode of homelessness. So we've definitely seen that. We've also seen a greater push for public housing authorities to also implement this type of approach, having a really coordinated like landlord engagement, landlord liaison, creating landlord incentives. We actually saw landlord incentives and landlord engagement be prioritized in the new emergency housing vouchers pilot program. We're seeing that in the mobility pilot program, which is a program for housing choice voucher families to get additional supports to find housing in high opportunity areas. And we're even seeing that in the latest round of moving to work public housing agencies, which is just a special designation that allows public housing agencies to have more flexibility. So that's Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, and now Harrisburg just got their MTW status, but they're in this special kind of landlord engagement cohort. So we're seeing a move there. The challenge is that you already have to have experienced the crisis and you already have to be involved in services. So we do not have that upstream support for, just a low cost, if not no cost leasing agent for low income households and households who may have other barriers to housing.
Right. Just to piggyback on that real quick, Rachel. So Gail's right? So essentially all of these, the continuum of cares have their navigators, these other organizations have their navigators, housing authorities have the relationships they work with, but nobody has linked up and created that central resource, made that information public, right? And made it available to these people who aren't entrenched in these systems, right? And when we talked about earlier about collaborative efforts, right? Wouldn't that make sense to create something like that, right? But I think what you see is everybody's so tribal and possessory of their landlords because there's this inventory shortage, right? So continuum of cares are trying to get people moved out of these shelters, out of these systems. They need to get people housed with their landlords, but it's hard for them to share their resources if they're strained on their end. But I think there is opportunity there to create some of these programs and make them available to the public. There's websites that speak to it, but by the time people get to those websites, those units have gone months ago. So, but I think that would be a nice thing to see happen, if not regionally, at least in local communities.
Okay, and I think we have a minute for one more quick question before we close out. And this isn't really a quick question, but maybe somebody can give a 2-minute answer. And that's, how do we overcome the stigma of using credit scores as a tool to discriminate against individuals?
I'll say real quick what we do. We try and get to landlords, right? We try and have those conversations. So if individuals apply, we know they're not going to meet the credit score. We try and tell the landlord that if we're advising people, they're in our programs, right? And they're coming with this sort of education and things behind them, right? And support behind them, case managers behind them, whatever the case may be, to kind of alleviate maybe some of those concerns, which are that they're going to default on their rent, right? So we're trying to do some of that back end education. The landlord say, hey, they're involved in all these other supportive programs. So maybe waive those fees or those requirements, allow this person to rent, and we think they'll be a successful tenant. There's levels of success with that, but I think having the conversations again are an important first step.
Okay, well, I want to quickly say thank you to all of the panelists for taking the time this morning. We have one face here that we haven't introduced up on the screen, who will provide our closing comments. Erin Smith is the board president of the Housing Equality Center. She's also the government affairs manager of the Suburban Realtors Alliance and has worked with us for a long time, bringing that collaboration with the industry and, really prioritizing the compliance education and industry work holding itself to a very high standard regarding fair housing. So I'm going to let Erin close us out, but thank you all so much for being here.
Yes, thanks, Rachel. And thank you so much to our panelists for taking part in this conversation today. Carolyn, Jordan, April, Gail, Michelle, and Ira, we all have so much to think about and to read. I'm sure all of you have been watching the conversation in the chat, and there are tremendous resources that have been put in there. And your thoughtful remarks and resources really do help us all to get our hands around these issues. And thank you also to all of our attendees today. It is so important that engagement extends to every part of our community here. I would like to also thank Rachel and Carolyn and Patricia, who are central to the great work that the Housing Equality Center of Pennsylvania does. that work is done by the HECP. It's so important to this region. Please visit equalhousing.org and follow the Housing Equality page on Facebook for more information about future events. So again, thank you to everyone who participated today in this Fair Housing Month event.
Thank you so much, everybody, and we'll talk to all of you very soon in these really important conversations. Thanks so much.